afternoon, and thank you for joining us for the State Performance Plan Technical Assistance Project webinar, Disrupting Inequities, a Call for Interruption and Transformation by Dr. Gregory Peters. My name is Jim DeShazer, and I am the TA Systems Coordinator for the project. And before we begin, I just want to let you know that everyone's speakers have been muted, so we'll be participating via chat if you have any questions. Before we begin, I just want to let you know, for those who are not familiar with the State Performance Plan Technical Assistance Project, we are funded by the California Department of Education Special Education Division, and I'll go over a few of the services that are available before we introduce Dr. Peters. So first off, one of our services that we provide, supports we provide to the field, are webinars such as the one we are having today, addressing disproportionality. We also provide communities of practice for districts identified as significantly disproportionate. We have our website, which has many resources available for those interested in addressing disproportionality and the many topics associated. We also provide ongoing assistance to districts, again, who are interested in addressing disproportionality. So if you have any questions, you can always contact us directly, myself, Jim DeShazer, or Connie Silver-Bessard, and our emails are available right there. Today we have multiple ways for you to participate in the webinar. You can participate via chat, as you see below in the box below the slides. We'll have a whiteboard where we'll actually share how you can participate on those polls and Q&As. And I also wanted to let everybody know that we are recording these webinars. All of our webinars are recorded and then archived on our website for anybody else who would like to share these webinars with. All right, and before we begin, I'd like to introduce Dr. Gregory Peters. He is a school reform leader with a long-standing history working within both local and national efforts. Dr. Peters leads the San Francisco Coalition of Essential Small Schools, which is committed to interrupt and transform current and systemic educational inequities to ensure all students have access to personalized, equitable, and high-performing schools that believe and demonstrate each student can and should and will succeed. Towards this mission, Gregory facilitates equity-focused educational transformation throughout the nation. Thank you again, Gregory, for joining us today, and we look forward to hearing from you.
Thank you. Good afternoon, everyone, and thank you for joining us for this webinar on disrupting inequities. So let's just jump right in. I'd like to start by reviewing the objectives and what I hope by the end of this session you will have walked away with. So by the end of this webinar, each of you should be able to consider, or will have had an opportunity to consider, the connection between doing your own work, your own identity work, and interrupting inequities that exist for your students, in particular your least reached students. By the end of the webinar, you should have had the opportunity to explore how students across difference may experience implicit biases, and by the end of the seminar, you should have had the opportunity to just begin to review some suggestions and strategies for more effectively engaging with and for your students across difference. As I said, we're going to jump right in, and so even before I begin presenting, I would actually like to do pre-activity. We're trying to make this webinar as interactive as possible, and so I'm not sure how many people have participated in a chalk talk before in person, but in general, a chalk talk is a strategy, it's a protocol for engagement that provides a different pace for thoughtful contemplation as we ask people to engage silently by writing on a chalkboard or chart paper, etc., in order to generate ideas and check understanding about some topics. In general, for this adapted version, we're going to ask that everybody consider and is encouraged to participate by either responding to the initial prompts that you'll see in a moment on the whiteboard, or by responding to other people's comments. You can add comments to other comments, add questions. You can bring attention by highlighting or circling, etc. And really the idea is to write as you feel moved. Pauses and quiet time is natural, but in those pauses, I would encourage you to just be reading and contemplating what you're reading from other folks, because it's meant to be a different type of dialogue. So we're going to hear a little bit more about the tool before we jump right into it.
Thanks, Gregory. This is Susan, and I wanted to show you that in just a few moments, the screen is going to change, and you're going to have a toolbar like that just pops up on the screen that will give you the options to write on the chalkboard that we're going to have. The first thing that I want to show you is the text tool. So what you'll need to do is click on that text T and then move your cursor over to the chalkboard that you'll see in a minute and click on the chalkboard. Then you'll see a little text field that pops up. You can type in there. The most important thing is after you're done typing, click outside of that text box so other people can see what you've written. Just as a heads up, there's quite a few of us on the webinar, and so there may be some words that overlap. That's okay. I will try to move things quickly so that people can see what other people have written. Then, if you want to either circle or put a box around what somebody has said, you can do that by clicking on the square in that toolbar. And the key with that is you need to put the cursor at the top left of whatever you want to indicate you want to square or circle, and then drag it, and you'll see the circle appear as you're doing it. Once you let go, your circle is complete. So hold on your mouse down until you're finished with drawing. And the same for this icon up at the top. It's a pen icon, and there's some other options, highlighting and things like that, if you click on that little white arrow just to the right and lower right of that pen icon. Again, you can draw between things using that tool. So I'm going to move us over into the Chalk Talk layout, and if you have any problems with those tools, let me know. I'm going to put some text in the chat box so that you can refer back to that if you need to.
Great. So the Chalk Talk is in front of you, and the prompts are in front of you. There's two different prompts. They're meant to be side by side. The first prompt is, what is the purpose of schools? And the second prompt is, what is the purpose of education? And so I just want to invite us for about 4 minutes, 5 minutes or so, just to engage both with these prompts and with each other. And we'll just do this in quiet, and when we're finished, I'll do a little reflection based on what we see written. We have just another couple of minutes at most, and so again, if you're not writing something, please, it's amazing to see all these words popping up, but please try to read as much as you can. Go ahead and finish up that last word or thought. And then again, just, it's amazing. I know it's going to be hard to read some of these because they're flowing over each other. So I'd like to just offer a couple of thoughts, a couple of reflections about what it is that I'm reading. And it's not unusual. We do this work with many groups at the beginning of forming community so that we can even check if we have common understanding of some of the most basic key terms that are associated with the work we do, school and education. And so it's not unusual that you will find that some folks will have, you'll find similar definitions or similar responses in either side of the chart, and then you'll find some responses that are different. When I see the similar responses, that's an indicator for me that this is an opportunity for good discourse amongst the community to try and make meaning together. It's an opportunity to look at the history of education, look at the history of public schools and the design of our structures and systems. But I really like the differences that we see in between these as well. And as I'm reading these, and I haven't been able to read all of them, but I'm reading most of them, one of the things that sticks out to me is that the idea of reproduction or status quo or socialization feels like a prevalent or presence in the response to the purpose of school or schools, while liberation and sort of the word that came up for me was unleashing, sort of the potential within seemed to be the pattern or a pattern that I was reading in the purpose of education. And so I was just thinking as I was reading this, the question that came up to me is to what extent are schools or the purpose of schools or the way schools are playing out places where we train young people, and to what extent is the purpose of education to unleash and to give scaffolding and tools to folks. So thank you so much for engaging in this chalk talk, and hopefully this has already got your brains wrapped around some questions and some challenges and some dissonance around even just language as we move into the formal webinar. So as we wait for the slides to come through, I want to say that the title of this is about interruption and disrupting the status quo, but the purpose of interruption itself, you'll hopefully walk away understanding, is not enough. That we're interrupting, and then the hope and goal is for us to have spaces where transformation can take place. And frequently, the word transformation is popping up more and more and more, and we're seeing it played out and used more like a buzzword. And so it's important for us when we have these power words, this professional language of educators on the table, that we take time to understand why we're using certain language, how we're using that language, what the meaning of it is. And so when we think about why transformation, it's important for us to realize that our current reality, our current system of public education, our current reality as in our social construct is not by happenstance, that it is built on a system of generations of design and work, and we stand on a legacy of colonization and slavery in this country. And that even though many of us might say those deplorable acts happened so many generations ago, what has that got to do with today? Even though some of the more deplorable acts happened generations ago, their impact has played out, and there has been an iterative process of its influence throughout our evolution as a society. And so there has been a historical, a systemic influence of our roots that is yet to be fully interrupted. And they play out even in our schools and the people who walk into our schools, the educators, the families, etc. And when you have schools that come from an iterative influence of oppression and bias, and you have people and communities that have been formed by their historic engagement with that iterative process, they interact with each other. Our educators and our schools interact with each other to create a cycle of reproduction where there are hegemonic beliefs and values that continue to go unexamined, that are taken as the default status quo. And so the idea is, even if we were to tweak inequities when they occur in front of us, we're still working in a system that is very reproductive, very self-repairing, and so what we're really seeking is transformation. Now that was a lot of words, considering that James Baldwin actually said the same thing much more eloquently and beautifully when he said, "We are trapped in our history, and our history is trapped in us." And so when we think about transformation, the idea is to be able to liberate, to learn from and liberate ourselves from our history that is trapped within us. I want to just share an example of how that plays out by talking about one of the districts with whom we work. And so one of the districts with whom we partner is very much committed to interrupting the status quo and the predictability of demographics. This is a school where the population of students, the African American students in the student population represent about 10% on any given year. So about 10% of their student body identifies as African American. And yet when we look at their special ed population of that same district, the referrals and the special ed students, about 25% of the special ed students are represented by students who identify as Black or African American. And then when we look at those students who are in the ED or emotionally disturbed program, the numbers get more concerning, where roughly 50% of that population is represented by students who identify as Black or African American. And then in that district, when they looked at their suspensions, that narrative continued in the wrong direction, where roughly 75% of all of their suspensions were represented by or were indicative, or I'd like to say, the language I like to use is pushed out. That of the suspensions, roughly 75% of the students that were being pushed out through suspensions were identified as African American or Black. And again, this is in a district where 10% of the students are identified as African American or Black. So that's that disproportionality. That's that significant disproportionality that we're talking about. This district took it very seriously. They were very concerned about this, and they went full in with incredible resources and commitment to disrupt this data. And they embarked on a multi-year, 100% of their schools engaged process where they were bringing in interventions and intervention models to really turn these numbers around. The good news, the great news, was that it was incredibly effective. The numbers, just looking at suspensions, the number of suspensions were radically decreased. They were decreased exponentially. It was absolutely phenomenal work. And when they looked closer at the numbers, one of the things that came up was that the disproportionality changed not an iota. So what they learned was that there were ways of keeping all students in class, and that affected all students positively, including African American students. So these strategies, these structures were really, really powerful. And yet even in those positive teaching, those positive program structures and changes that were taking place, the bias persisted. And what they found was that roughly 75% of even the incredibly reduced number of suspensions were still African American students. So I'd like to just give a moment for you all, and I know this is a webinar, but we are trying, as you can already tell with the chalk talk, trying to shake it up and have people be as interactive as possible. So I'd love to give a moment for you just to even just think to yourself, what's the story of your district? Why are you on a webinar about disrupting inequities? What's the story what's the first story that comes to mind of your district? So I know I'm using this language bias, and there's just some incredible work out there right now about implicit bias. And it's really important that we're taking the time and examining what is that bias that is so ingrained, that is so internalized, that it's invisible to us, that we don't even realize that that's playing out. We think that we are fair to everybody. We don't consider ourselves to have any sense of prejudice or bias, and we love all of our children. And yet, the data continues to show that implicit bias is having a dramatic effect and impact on folks that are not in dominant culture. And yet, what I want to surface in this slide is that even that language of implicit bias, while that's an important topic that we cannot ignore and we have to take up, I want to make sure we don't fall into the trap of using that language to sanitize or to create a sense of innocence or fresh start that we get to say because it's invisible, there's this sense of innocence. And so I want to raise the question of, when we think about bias and implicit bias, what is implicit and what is explicit, and to whom? And so the truth of the matter is that our students are actually watching. So even when my own implicit biases are playing out, they are invisible to me. If I'm a person who's striving to be a social justice leader, my implicit biases are still going to play out. They're invisible to me. And yet to sit on that word that they're invisible to me almost assumes a level of innocence where, my intentions are really good. And so there can be quick forgiveness. And yet, one of the things that we know to be true is that while they may be invisible to me, those who are affected by my implicit bias, it may not be so implicit or invisible to them. And so our students are watching, and they see who's in the hallways and who's being pushed out of the classes. And this is a constant message of invalidation, either for me and my people or for others. Our students are watching. They see who's in the news. And that narrative and that disproportionate messaging is very dehumanizing, and that sense of dehumanization comes with us in our other arenas. And over time, our children are watching, and they internalize these messages. And more and more and more in the work that we're doing, where we're trying to bring student voice into the conversation, we're actually hearing the messaging of implicit bias play out even for those who are being oppressed, where students are actually internalizing this message and calling themselves the bad kid. They're seeing themselves as the other. But it's really important to know that all of our students are watching. And so even the students who might not be feeling the damage and the harm of oppression on them, we're training our next generation of adults around bias. When we wonder where that bias comes from, where it's taught, it's not just taught by people who have overt hate messaging that they're trying to teach their children. It is taught by the messaging we see every single day when we walk in our halls, when we look at the news, etc. And so the idea of putting this out there and really saying that implicit bias is critical for us to examine for ourselves and look in the mirror at our own bias, that implicit bias is explicit to others. And I just say that to surface and really raise this urgency, this sense of urgency that this work is necessary, because we are being watched every day, and what we are demonstrating, what we are modeling is educating our next generations. One of the things that's important, I know, we talk about this word bias because there are many isms, and yet one of the things that is very important for me and for my organization to do is to elevate and isolate race. We are not saying that race and racism are the only biases that we need to be addressing in our schools, not by a long shot. But we do elevate race because what we have learned is that when we think about the isms or the demographics that seem to matter the most in being predictive of how well we teach and reach our young people, race not only is at the top of the list for its impact, but it's also at the top of the list of those topics with which we least want to discuss. And so as it's the one that we want to talk about least, we actually start by talking about race, but we know also that there are other isms. One of the reasons that race is an important, well, let me just start with Robert Jensen's quote. Race is a fiction we must never accept, and race is a fact we must never forget. And I love the simplicity of this quote because what it really surfaces for us is this false dichotomy we get into. And the truth of the matter is race does not exist. It's a man-made construct. It's actually not real. And yet, what we know to be true is that the impact of this man-made construct is so very real for so many people every single day. And our work as educators, it is not until the impact of race is erased that we can actually lean on the comfort of the fact that race does not exist. In trying to bring up the topic of race, and even when we know we have to talk about race, we still get stuck. And we get stuck because we frequently get caught up or stuck in our head asking the wrong questions. Frequently, we'll be asking the question, we'll get into the semantics or the theoretical topics such as, well, are all white people racist? And in particular, as a white man, my people really want to take up this question because we're looking for the opportunity to be one of those good white people, one of the white people who are not racist. And that's the wrong question. That's because there's facts that we can talk about. We can answer that question. We shouldn't have to spend a lot of time on that. It's similar to the debate of whether or not reverse racism exists. I'm not saying that shouldn't be taken up, but that should not be the journey of our work together. Instead, we should be pushing ourselves into questions that really allow us to sit in inquiry and explore the conditions and results of our work, of our workplaces, of our schools, for our students. So an example of a question that we should be taking up is closer to, how do all white people benefit from institutionalized racism in the U.S.? And perhaps even more specific to the context of our work, how do dominant culture people benefit from institutionalized racism in our schools? These are the questions we should be pushing closer to so that we can really just be sitting in that inquiry, making meaning together, and not looking for the quick answer so that we can put ourselves on one side or the other side. So why is it that we don't want to talk about race? Why is it that we still, even though the data suggests we have to be, even though if we just look at our national context, we have to be talking about race in order to better support and serve our young people and to create the world that we just said education and schools are intended to be preparing them for. I have a colleague and a friend who shared with me a fact that has turned into a mantra of mine, and she says that every action that we take comes from one of two emotions. And the first is love, and the second is fear. And I really appreciated that, and it really has become a mantra of mine because I think sometimes we get caught up in, if something isn't coming from love, it must be coming from hate. And this really flips the script here and makes me to realize that even when something is either shared in a way that feels hateful or experienced in a way that feels hateful, it too is coming from fear. And so it allows me to sort of sit in and be able to build bridges across difference more readily when I recognize that everything we do comes from either love or fear. And I do believe that the main obstacles to talking about race are based in fear. First, there's fear of even just saying the word race. There is fear that if the topic comes up, if we're going to take up the issue of race, this equates to being called a racist. And so the word race is somehow superimposed with the word racist automatically. It's not to say that the two shall never meet. That sometimes in talking about race, we have to talk about racism. We have to talk about racist acts. We have to talk about being racist. But the idea that every time the word race is discussed, there's a fear that that's equated with being called a racist is a fear that keeps us from talking about race. Furthermore, there's a fear of losing unearned privileges. And if we do the work of understanding the system of racism, we will do the work of recognizing that whether we signed up for it or we didn't sign up for it, the way that racism works, the way that institutionalized racism works, is that some people benefit from that system and receive unearned privileges. And even the most socially just-minded folks who are willing to give up their own privileges for the sake of a more equitable, and not give up privileges in general, but just give up unearned privileges. Even those folks find the obstacle of staying on this road when we realize that that idea of learning unearned privileges also extends to our offspring. And the idea of me saying, I'm willing to lose some unearned privileges from my white skin privilege, but that's a really hard conversation and a really hard decision that parents have to make when they think about which of their, if their children are going to get into their school of choice, if their child is going to, be seen as the valedictorian, et cetera. And so this innate fear, before we've done the work to understand the complexity of it, and quite frankly, that it's the idea of creating an equitable society is not one of equalizing oppression, but it's one of just allowing for people not to be standing on other people's backs to take their unearned privileges. The idea of doing that hard work is actually, even before we get to the place of doing that hard work, that fear keeps us from talking about race. And then lastly, what I'd like to offer with regards to this fear is probably the most radical thought to put out in a webinar is that, again, as we do our study together and we realize that these systems of oppression have existed by design for a long time, we start to internalize and accept, consciously or unconsciously, that a knowledge of how those folks who have not been in the majority have been treated. And as we get into a time in our society where dominant culture people, white people, will no longer be the quote-unquote majority, meaning that they're not going to be over 50%, there's this invisible pressure or this narrative out there that somehow that means that we are going to be the minority. And there is a fear, knowing even in our most unconscious ways, how those who have not been in control have been treated. There's a fear that by not being in control, we will be treated in that same harmful and painfully tragic way. And so all of these fears keep us from talking about race, which is exactly why we need to talk about race. Because when we isolate race, when we elevate the topic of race, it helps us to see the systemic role race has played in our historic realities and design and in our current realities. And when we start to bring meaning to it and we take away or we address some of those fears, we start to be able to engage in the work that needs to happen for us to interrupt the predictability of race on our students' experiences and achievement. So back to transformation. Carl Jung says, if there's anything that we wish to change in the child, we should first examine it and see whether it is not something that could better be changed in ourselves. And the power of this is that those of us, I would imagine everyone on this webinar, so many of the educators in our country really want change to happen for our students. We really don't want to see the predictive, disproportionate realities that are coming out of our schools. And so many folks with that earnest zeal to create change will start by looking out the window and think about what needs to change, like how if that student were to change what they're doing, or if that family were to change what they're doing, how things could be so much better. And while there is a partnership here, what we know to be true is that on real transformation, transformation starts from the inside. And so at the very simplest, the theory of transformation suggests that the work we do towards transformation must be inside-out work. This means that, and it's not just about creating change, it's about transformation, which is sustained change. And so we need to begin and experience the transformation we want for others with ourselves first. And so we have to commit to doing personal transformational identity work in order to create professional change that is not just, hey, I went to this workshop, they said I should try this, I'm going to try it, if it works, if it doesn't, it doesn't. But rather really shifting and changing the very belief systems, the very schemas of how we look at the world so that our professional practice changes from what it was, because what it was wasn't working. And so no matter how many more times I'm going to change, I know that it has to change. And then when my professional practice has changed in a sustained way where I'm in a constant cycle of inquiry, a constant cycle of improvement, what ends up happening is we start to see those results, and those results start to sustain as well. And when we talk about transferred transformation, we're not just talking about the transformation of our young people and their results, but we start to become agents of change where people look to us as models, and the peers around us are recognizing the cycle of transformation we're in and the processes that we're in, and all of a sudden there is a ripple effect, a domino effect on creating a culture where transformation is normalized. And that's what my career has been dedicated to, and that's what our organization is seeking to do. And as a result, we've created a conceptual framework for transformation, and we think this is important, again, because we know that there's these buzzwords, and I found it very difficult to find anybody who didn't believe transformation was something worth exploring in their schools and their practice, etc. But I also found it very hard to find places where there were models of what that meant and what that looked like. And so I had the great fortune of actually basing my dissertation on studying this work and working with students and teachers who were identified by their students as transformed. Not as transformative, there's a lot of research about that, but actually as teachers who had transcended this predictive role that teachers are supposed to play in reproductive schools, and somehow been able to work in those systems and fight against those systems at the same time to create different realities for their students. And there are 4 stages that that resulted in this framework, and I'm going to state them real quickly right now, and then the rest of the webinar is going to be unpacking each of those 4 stages. The first stage, and again, I want to just start by saying, I'm going to say the first stage because this is where we start, and it's an important place to start, but when we are in a cycle of transformation, this framework really suggests and insists upon the fact that this cycle must be constant, it must be continuous. And there are times when we are actually in multiple stages at the same time. The question we're asking when we're trying to create conditions for transformation in our schools with our educators is we try to identify from a community place, where is the place that needs attention right now for us to support conditions for this work to happen. And so the first stage is that of stance and schema awareness. And this is the idea that we have to create spaces and we have to create conditions, and we have to walk in with some knowledge to share, some history and knowledge to share around identity. And that is both the identity of ourselves, of our communities, and of each other. And this is not about changing our identity, changing our stance, but it's really hard to transform to something if we haven't taken the time to understand what are we transforming from. So this is really more about self-assessment, identity work around really giving language to who we are, what is our culture, how do we make meaning of the world, what is our history, both shared and individualized. The second stage is really about creating conditions for interruptive and catalytic experiences. And so what we know to be true is that evolution happens, which is great. People evolve. And we know that that is in no way fast enough for what our least reached students need to happen in schools. So we have to accelerate the process, and one of the ways that we accelerate the process is to create conditions that allow us to embrace catalysts that allow us to really push forward faster, but also that allow us to be interruptive to inequities when they surface and present themselves in the moment. Creating opportunities and conditions for interruptive and catalytic experiences in and of itself is not enough for transformation to take place, because most of us, the vast majority of us, are in this field to make change. So if we are perpetuating inequities, the high probability is we were doing our best not to. The high probability is we were doing what we believe to be really good work. And so what we need to do is to slow down and to create spaces where we can actually look at our inequities, look at our situations, and create very different meaning of them. And that slowing down is very counterintuitive in the pace of public education. But we know that creating space for meaning-making to occur allows us to think differently about our inequities, which then brings us to our fourth stage, where then we're called to really have change or radically new or bold actions take place. So it's not about tweaking the pieces on the puzzle. It's talking about really deconstructing and reconstructing the conditions and the situations and the dynamics before us. So that's, in general, the four stages. What I'd like to do is to take us now to each stage individually and talk a little bit about those. So when we talk about stance and schema awareness or our identity work, that we're talking about, really cultural competency matters here, cultural proficiency matters here. And when we talk about creating conditions for that, this is an opportunity to deepen the awareness and knowledge of ourselves, of our system, and of each other. And we do this in a number of ways. And again, this is constant and continuous work, so it's not like there's 3 activities we do. This is just, we build this into our learning plans, into our professional development, into our collaboration time. But we must continuously explore the operant theory behind our identity and our history. We must continuously understand, why is it that schools work the way they do? Why is this policy in place? What are the laws that are affecting us? What is the history? But also to ourselves. What is my history as a white man? What were the lessons I was taught from my family, from my community, and also what did I learn as a white student in our system that might have applied to me and might have given me some advantage, but might not actually play out for everybody. So we have to constantly be engaged in this reflection about the operant theory behind our identity and our history. Also, we need to consistently and constantly interrogate our current reality based on data, design, and decisions. And what that means is, when we have the work in front of us, when we have our school design in front of us, when we're looking at our master schedule, when we're looking at policy changes, when we're looking at our data, we need to get out of the habit of the quick fixes so that we can check off the boxes and really go into these conversations and these inquiries with an interrogative lens to really ask ourselves, what about this status quo policy? What about this way of looking at data? What about this design that's in place is meant to make our lives easier versus really interrupt the inequities? And what about this might be actually causing us to get the results that we're actually saying we want to interrupt? And so we have to have that constant interrogation on that which is around us. And finally, we need to be able to surface cultural differences as such, in other words, as differences, rather than cultural barriers. And this requires a constant engagement and muscle building around cultural proficiency. And we need to constantly be doing the work of educating ourselves around cultural proficiency and practicing and engaging in systems that allow us to develop more and more culturally proficient, so that we are honoring and respecting the pluralism of our schools, while not pitting them against each other and creating barriers based on our diverse cultural ways of making meaning of our world. So one of the things, again, in this idea of trying to be interactive is to try and do a couple of activities, and we'll see how they work on the webinar. So in a moment, I'm going to share an example of one piece of work we might ask a school community to do as a way of investigating, interrogating, understanding their own identity. Frequently, when we put labels on people, they're met with resistance. But when we give opportunities for people to name themselves and surface their own identities, it comes with more acceptance. And so as I model for you the piece of work we sometimes do with our folks, in your packets, if you downloaded them, you'll have your own blank gingerbread person like the one on the right. And as I model for you an example of how this activity happens, I'd love it if you were just jotting down some of your own ideas for yourself and how you'd answer the question, the skin you are in, just so that you could be engaged with that thinking and process as well. So it's not unusual that we might take some time and make meaning of this language, the skin I'm in, so that we can talk about identity. And when we're talking about the skin I'm in, at the most basic level, we're talking about those formative experiences, those pieces of our identity, whether they be demographic identity, community identity, etc., that really play out consciously or unconsciously anytime we walk in the room. If Greg Peters shows up, he's showing up with pieces of him that were based on formative experiences or cultural identities or demographics and how the world viewed me in ways that sometimes are unconscious to me and sometimes conscious to me. Our job is to bring language to it so that they're more and more and more conscious to us. So as an example, I'm just going to put a few words up here, and I'll talk through them to say, when I think about the skin I'm in, and it wouldn't happen this quickly, obviously, but I would take some time and do some reflective writing, etc., and think about what are those formative experiences. So one of the things you'll notice is there's the word male outside my stomach. I think it's really important that I identify as male, and I name that as part of the skin I'm in, because in that way, my gender puts me in the dominant side of culture. This is where behaviors and unearned privilege are normalized. And because I'm on that side of the formula, it's very easy for my gender to be invisible to me. It's very easy for me to take for granted the unearned privileges I have. And so I want to be able to name that and put that in as part of the skin I'm in as a reminder that that's a dynamic that plays out when I'm in the room, whether I'm aware of it or not aware of it. If you go below that, you'll see on one of the feet, it says politically and sexually queer. So growing up, I've always identified as a gay man. And then somewhere along the way in my life, my identity as a gay man became far more important to people around me than even to me. Like, it was just who I was. And somewhere along the way, my identity shifted, and I started to realize that I claimed this word queer not to invite other people to use that word on me, but I claimed it to reclaim some power. But I also claim it because it's actually, I've become much more political in response to some situations that have happened in my life that became very formative. So even though that's not how I was brought up to be thinking of myself that way, there were experiences in my life that became incredibly formative that becomes part of my identity. On the other foot, you see family first. And again, I hope that you're actually getting ideas and putting words on your own gingerbread person. Family first is a really important one for me because I grew up in a family where even if you didn't get along with somebody in your family, even if you didn't like the person in your family, if they were family, you had their back. That was instilled to our DNA. And so when I think about why that's important to me, it's important to me not just to people who are blood relatives, but it is what I've learned is that this has given me this definition of loyalty that I expect from people I consider in my family, even if they're not blood relatives. That does not always play out because people aren't aware of it. They didn't have that same sort of upbringing or messaging. And so it's important for me to name that and put that out there because that identifies a lot of my relationships. Ethnically, culturally, I identify as Lebanese and Italian. By the way, it's not by accident that's near my stomach. I love that food so much. And yet, it's so much more than just that food. So ethnically, culturally, Lebanese, Italian has given me morals, ways of being, ways of seeing the world and expressing myself that actually is not frequently shared by people around me. So that identity, that piece of my culture is really important for me to be aware of, because if somebody looks like me and I want to make an assumption that they're going to communicate in the same way I am or express themselves in the same way I do, that might be a leap, because some of that is not just about how I look, it's about how I was raised in my culture. My family grew up working poor and on food stamps, and that's in my hand, next to my hand on purpose, because what has probably been one of the most formative experiences for me, not only are the incredible work values that I have gained by growing up in a family that worked, you know, many times my family, members of my family worked 2 jobs, 3 jobs, etc. But also the contradiction of how our family was viewed as a result of being working poor caused such dissonance for me that it became really formative of my role and my desire to think about the difference between how we see people and how their narrative might be different. The last thing I'll speak to is that on my face, on my forehead, you see the word white. And that is the last one I want to talk about, and I put that right there on the face because similar to my gender, in a world where white is unfairly normalized, it might, my race might be invisible to me, and it's very important that I'm making the invisible visible in my journey of stance and schema awareness. And it's really important, not just because it's the right thing to do, but a long time ago I learned it does not matter if I see my whiteness or don't see my whiteness today. When I walk in a room of students who are predominantly not white, they see my whiteness, and their experiences with race come into that room and influence our relationship before we have a chance to develop a relationship. And so there is a responsibility for me to own my race and understand how that plays out across difference and in affinity with other people. So that's just my reflection. I hope you heard that as just modeling a reflection of the skin I'm in. And I really, again, I was hoping you were jotting down some words for yourself, but I'd love to just give another 30 or 40 seconds of quiet time that if you want to actually jot some other thoughts down so that you can start, because this isn't a presentation, this is a reflection out loud, but you can start your own reflection. So the last thing I want to say with schema awareness is that a student quote, to just bring some language to it, I actually think that it is true that teachers are taught to judge students when they first see them. Let's say they're black or something, some teachers will kind of be with a cautious approach, watching them and how they act. Or some teachers will just judge them and just separate them or something. So again, even when we are not conscious of the skin we are in, those with whom we work, those we are intending to serve, are very conscious about the skin we're in. So I want to move us quickly into this, or maybe not so quickly, but I want to move us into the second stage, the idea of interruptive and catalytic experiences and the need to create conditions for this to happen. Chief Joseph says, good words will not give my people good health and stop them from dying. Good words will not get my people a home where they can live in peace and take care of themselves. I am tired of talk that comes to nothing. It makes my heart sick when I remember all the good words and broken promises. So the challenge here is, how do we create conditions in order to really disrupt our mental models and to move out of our automated spaces? And so in doing this and creating these conditions, there needs to be both leadership and structure. And the leadership, we do need leadership so that we can get personal and organizational commitment. And we get personal and organizational commitment to this uncomfortable work of interruption and disruption by developing shared buy-in through community norms or agreements, and shared understanding of the mission and the vision, as well as some calibrated expectations of the work that's necessary. In schools where they have 10 different efforts going on and people are good members of the community as long as they commit to 5 of them, that work gets really mucked up, because what you really need to push forward is to have your core agreements of, this is the work 100% of us are here to do. And so it's real important that as we try to create choice for adults, we're very clear about what's not negotiable. In supporting that work, we sometimes need spaces to practice. We need lots of places to practice the type of discourse and the type of community building needed, so that when those spaces aren't structured, we can use those as scaffold and engage in the right conversations based on that practice. So we need opportunities for regularly deepening our community and trust building. We need places to go, like professional learning communities, where we're engaging in explicit equity-centered rituals and protocols. We need to be able to constantly explore and interrogate our language and calibrate our definitions for the important words such as accountability, equity, success, etc. We need to constantly make time, not just in August when we're trying to get to know each other, but constantly make opportunities and time and spaces for us to share stories about difference and about shared struggles. So share stories about where we differ and share stories about where we have commonalities, not just the obvious ones, but sometimes bringing people across difference to recognize that we have many things in common as well. And again, this work needs to be constant and continuous cycles of work. So I just wanted to walk through, as an example, this idea of community norms. And when we talk about community norms, we go into many schools, and some of the schools that we go into, they're creating norms that really are more reproductive of the status quo. Again, normal school norms versus liberation norms. And the idea is that, how do we create norms that it's more than just the job description? Because when we look at this first one, be on time, I don't understand why that's a norm when in most jobs, if you're not on time, you don't have a job. And so what we really want to do is really change this idea that a norm is a description of the aspiration of how we want to be together to really reach and stretch to the goals we have. So instead of being on time, we would think about or suggest stay engaged. And by stay engaged, this isn't the traditional 50s black and white film where everyone's in rows with pencils in their hands, but rather this is having strategy, structures, and support that when the conversation gets hard, when the work gets hard and we want to move to fight, flight, or freeze, we have strategies to re-engage us and keep us in that difficult work. We also hear a lot this idea of being respectful as a norm. My question when I see be respectful as a norm is, if we don't have that as a norm, is it acceptable to be disrespectful? Why are we making such a low bar for the aspirations of where we want to be? Frequently when we have norms such as be respectful, what we're really trying to do is keep people comfortable. The sad reality is, in our schools where some folks are being served better than other folks, the people we're trying to keep comfortable are the folks that are being served better. Because the truth of the matter is, if I'm in a school that does not value me, that does not seek for me to achieve equitable results, I'm already uncomfortable. So if that's okay, that I'm uncomfortable, but we're being respectful so others aren't comfortable, we're actually reinforcing the message of hegemony. And so this is why an alternative norm that we would suggest would be experience discomfort. Another example would be step up, step back. That's more of a goal of equality, where we want to make sure we hear from everybody the same amount of times, the same amount of time, versus really opening up to inquiry around paying attention to patterns of participation. Are we understanding how power dynamics and how demographics are playing out in patterns of participation, not only how frequently and how long people speak, but if they speak first to sort of direct the conversation, if they're constantly the last person to speak to sort of close and reclaim the conversation or the results of the conversation. And there's no right or wrong answer. This is about an inquiry so that we're engaging in the hard conversation about difference and how it plays out with power and participation. And then the last example would be this idea of assuming best intentions versus speaking your truth. Again, assuming best intentions is this idea of keeping people comfortable. This means that we get to sanitize our history. We get to erase all of the patterns that have existed before and assume that moving forward we're just, everyone's equal and everything is pure and everything is good. This, unfortunately, is more dehumanizing because when we assume best intentions, when we know that's not how it's actually played out, we're actually asking people who have been harmed to ignore that harm so we can move forward, versus healing spaces where we get to not only speak our truth, but hear each other's different truths. So just real quickly, and I'll ask that you put this in the chat, we'll take a minute or two. Are there any norms that are explicit in your community? Like, that we have the norms that are listed. Any of those explicit norms that may contradict with an implicit norm, meaning this is what we say we do versus this is what we do. And so I'd love to hear if there's some examples out there just to put out there for a minute or so. And here's an example right here. So we value family, but we have rigid work hours that don't support our family lives. Fantastic example. We explicitly say we want diverse leadership, but our leadership historically comes from females of one or two races. The stated norm, we find the third way. The reality, we defend that position. I love that. We can just see if we say one more, and then I'll move on. We seek to diversify our staff, and our management team is white. That's a critical one. I love that one because that really does require us to think how even with best intentions might we be predisposed to reproduce what is comfortable for us. That's a great one. Thank you. We listen to understand, and in reality, we listen to defend. We're against racism, but but if you point out racism, then you're a racist. These are great. Thank you. Thank you. I'm going to push us forward. When we talk about the third stage, we're talking about creating opportunities to make meaning, and this happens in 3 places. And I want to be really clear. This doesn't happen in 1 or 2 or 3 places. What we've learned is this happens in 3 places. And so we're going to talk about that, but Harini, an assistant principal, speaks about one of the spaces that is required, which is to be in affinity with people. Even as a leader, I felt isolated as a person of color. It makes me wonder how many other people of color without the same authority in my school feel. When we came together in affinity, at first it was healing and cathartic, wanting our voices to be unapologetically powerful and to be heard. We supported each other to engage authentically and patiently as our school makes meaning of the inequities. We supported each other to come together in solidarity and with love and compassion. So I love that quote that she shares. And so when we're talking about these 3 spaces, the first space we need to do is we need to create spaces for work to be done alone. Not all of us are in the same place. Very few of us are in the same place. We need to be able to start where we need to start. And if we're really talking about identity work, some of that work has to happen with us about our own histories, our own families. I do want to say while some of that work, and we want to create a norm that because this work is continuous, it's not just when we're clocked in, schools and communities can create places for some of that work to happen alone, even as part of the work that we do together through study groups, through article sharing, etc., and really systematizing reflection as part of a professional development plan. The second place we need to do work is in affinity, and that's what Harini was just speaking to. And when we talk about in affinity, again, as an organization, we elevate and talk about race. And so, yes, we're talking about meeting in racial-like groups, but when we're actually doing the work in the schools, we start with who are your least reached students. And when we think about the demographics and the predictability of demographics in your school, it might be gender, it might be class, it might be language. And so when we actually identify who the least reached students are, that becomes a layer in which we look at meeting in affinity and doing work in affinity as well. Sometimes with the intersectionality. There's a group, school we're working with where when they meet in affinity groups, they're meeting by race and gender, the intersectionality of race and gender. And the importance of working in affinity is that, one, we sometimes need to be with our own people so we can do some healing. And then two, sometimes we need to be with our own people because we have to do work that, quite frankly, the other people don't need to hear. Sometimes the work can actually happen differently when we're not worried about the filters of being across different groups. But the other reason that's really important that we learn that's important in affinity is we need to be able to have opportunities to be and to find mentors. And so mentorship is critical when we work in affinity. And then the last piece, and ultimately these first two pieces are leading to this, is we want to be able to work across difference because ultimately our goal is to be allies across difference for each other. And so organizing in folks across difference has to be intentional groupings. We really want to mix it up as much as possible, not just around demographics of race and gender, but even experience and grade level, et cetera. Like all of that type of stuff we want to have as much mixed perspective as possible to really widen how we make meaning of our inequities with multiple perspectives that we normally might not have access to. The spaces need to be mutually beneficial. We're not asking people who are feeling the impact of oppression to be there in service of changing the people who are oppressors, that we're actually looking to lift up and serve everybody equally in these spaces. And so that requires an intentionality around how that space is held. And as I said, ultimately, this is all towards alliance building. I said to you all that, the bad kids phrase earlier, that sometimes our students internalize their language. And so I'm going to read a poem that or a piece of a poem. You have the full poem with you, but I'm just going to read a piece of a poem that comes from students, middle school students that we interviewed, and their interviews were so powerful that their language turned into a poem for their school. And this is another example of being able to hear perspectives across difference. So it just doesn't have to be the people in the room. And so how we bring our students' voice to the room is also important. And so as I read this, I'm just going to ask you, as feelings come up for you, as reactions come up for you, if in the box that just popped up, you could just type out a word that is a feeling, a reaction, or anything like that, just as a way of having some visual processing as you hear these words. So I'm going to begin reading. It's called Bad Kids. Not one of them, not one answered, because I have to. When asked, why do you come to school, every one of them said, they come to school to learn. I like to learn and to see my friends. I want to go to college, to be a lawyer. I want to play sports. I want to be a doctor. I am here to learn. I want to get an education. On the other hand, they could not answer, why were you chosen to be in this room today? Awkward pause, searching for the correct answers, reading adult glances for the correct answer. We're the favorites? The first answer quickly, immediately denounced. We are the bad kids. Now I am squashing quickly the response in hope that it not attach, as each student is thanked for being there, willing to share brilliance, to support their principal, to better support them. Clear that failure lie with adults, not them. Clear that they represent the students not being served as well as the others because they are students of color. Awkward pause, reading the room, checking if the data is correct. The company of peers is no cause for surprise. Rather, this group of geniuses conveys confoundedness at the white man making visible that which seems to have preferred invisibility. So what does your school think about you, and how do you know? We are the bad kids, bad kids, voices stepping on each other to reinforce that which actually was known to them. This is where the ice breaks. This is where their confidence is established, their presence is asserted. they did have a place and purpose in this room where African American students gathered for focus group amongst principals, seeking insight for the only population not being served in a diverse community that seemed able and willing to serve others, but not them. School seemed successful, remarkably successful in educating these middle school scholars who had mastered, internalized the projected curriculum about themselves. We are the bad kids. We are bad kids. We are bad. Over and over and over. They repeat over and over and over and over. We are the bad kids. We are bad kids. We are bad. So I'm wondering if people would post just a couple of reactions, feelings, or thoughts. Two people wrote familiar. Desire to learn, dissonance, wanting to please, internal narrative. Easier to call students bad than see them as who they are and serve them well. Harsh truth, able to serve others but not them. We have done this to our children, scholars, no excuses. Distortion of self-identity. So my question as you continue to post and continue to feel is, what opens up when we recognize that there's an interruption that needs to take place and we create space to hear from others? What opens up when we have an emotional attachment or we just are able to just hear a different understanding? How does that influence us to actually move into our final stage and really think radically of, like, how does this lift us, empower us, energize us to have radical change or really bold new actions? So thank you for posting. And maybe there'll be an opportunity for us to, when we make this public, have that document available to be shared. And so our last stage, and we're coming to the end of our presentation, is this idea of bold new action. As I said, like when we actually make new meaning, hopefully we not only see things differently, but we feel differently in order to really take that bold new action. Malcolm X says we can't teach what we don't know and we can't lead where we won't go. And hopefully the first three stages are getting us to a place of going to places we otherwise might not have gone before. And when we think about bold new actions, one of the tensions that we recognize is that bold new actions are going to come with consequences and reactions from people that aren't even in our community because there is an investment in protecting the status quo. And so one of the things that we know about adult learning theory is that we have to create conditions that allow for us to take these bold new actions and also be responsive to the fact that these conditions have to be thoughtful of the follow-through or the leadership of and the responsibility of these actions. And so there's a constant tension between autonomy and accountability. That, you know, I've been in schools where they're saying what they really need is just teacher accountability and really just hold people accountable for those results. And I've been to schools where they say we just need teacher autonomy. If we just trust teachers, they'll be able to solve their problems. And yet the way that the system works is that there's a relationship between these. And it's important to create conditions that allows for that relationship to be supported. And so one example of autonomy, as far as to have that autonomy, is that teachers and educators, they need time and resources. And so many of our schools have a limit to the human resources, to the capital resources, and to time. But with that, if we're going to create that condition and give the time and resources, there needs to be shared leadership. And you don't get shared leadership by just saying everyone's a leader. The shared leadership, just like with positional leadership, requires leadership development. So there has to be an investment in both of these. We also need, for autonomy, we need to have our inquiry and our data be very transparent to everybody to inform that autonomy. But with that, transparency about, or should I say, and with that transparency of inquiry and that data needs to be a shared commitment to results. And so that we aren't making data and inquiry transparent so that we can then point the finger and say somebody else is responsible for it, that we have to share that commitment to the results. We need to invest greatly in more and more and more time and opportunities for people to collaborate and have professional development, which is very, very different than staff meetings where there's a person standing at the front and just going through announcements. There needs to be, and it's just not that once a week, that really we need to create, schools need to become learning spaces so that no matter whether it be a formal space or an informal space, the practices of shared learning and shared work are just normalized in all of our interactions. One of the things that comes with that, however, for that accountability piece is that that isn't limited to just the people inside the school, that we have to widen the diverse perspectives in these collaborations, and there needs to be formal external partnerships, and that includes with families, CBOs, etc. And so it has to really be widened. And then probably the most challenging of the conditions we need to create in this balance of autonomy and accountability is one where we need to reclaim the narrative about risk and failure. This is not to say that we want that failure is okay, because there's different kinds of failures. But if I know that the way that we're doing business right now is not going to work, we have enough history, enough pattern that it's not going to work, we need to create an opportunity where informed risk and the possible failure that results, not to just repeat the previous failure, is actually thought of differently and celebrated. And our school systems are places where really it's a dumping ground of blaming educators for our social ills. And so what does it mean to create a place where we can actually celebrate risk-taking and failure as part of as part of progress, just like we should be doing with our students? Versus the failure of doing harm. And for that to happen, we need to radically rethink how we do support and evaluation. And the good news is there's some incredible models out there that already do this. I have worked at a school, I've worked at multiple schools rather, where they have really rethunk support and evaluation to support this idea of having informed risk and failure. The dilemma is that that's not systematized, and that the system is actually frequently fights against systematizing, rethinking support and evaluation. So these are just some examples of conditions that would allow us to be in that fourth stage. So I want to end by just asking you all, and again, if you could just do this in the chat, or if you want at the end, you might do this in your feedback form where it asks for extra comments. But I just want to end with one question to you all, just having presented some of our thinking and some of our work to you and how we flow through this framework for transformation. Given this call to interrupt and transform inequalities, leaving today, I really want to ask you to sit with yourself for a second and ask, to what do you commit? What is it that you can leave here that you can commit to do, or just one step or one action, big or small? So in the next 30 seconds or so, if someone wants to sort of jot some of that down in the chat just so that could be transparent, that's very vulnerable but also wonderful modeling. If not, I would just ask that you put that commitment on your feedback form at the end, and in about 30 seconds we'll use whatever time we have left for any Q&A. As we transition into Q&A, I'll actually say one of my commitments in the national context we have is to seek opportunities to, while I feel like I walk in with many, I feel like I'm being stretched in my life to figure out how to form bridges rather than walls with folks I traditionally didn't have that opportunity or need to form those bridges with, so I thought. And so I'm going to spend a lot of my time really continuing to think about how to further develop my muscle and skill to develop bridges with folks who have who are across difference of thinking with me, and to be able to and the evidence of that would be to forge new partnerships. And there are some questions up here. Great. So I guess this is where we move into some of the questions. And so I'm going to read through a couple of these. So is it a trap to call racism microaggression? Can the dissertation be added to the Dropbox? We have strong community pressure to take immediate action. How do you balance the need to take action to save lives with the need to deep internal work? I'm drawn to that question. I like all the questions, but I'm going to read them all, and then I might go to that one first. I hear a lot about needing safe spaces to develop this understanding, but I think there's an urgency that preempts safety, as those who want safety have typically had it, and those who have the urgency have not. Thoughts about balancing those two questions are similar. Do you have examples of school districts who have succeeded in this transformation? And agree with the question, the previous question, anecdotes from the work in action would be both informative and inspirational. Great. So let me go to the middle questions first, this idea of the pressure to have immediate action versus it takes time, and this idea of safe spaces versus some people sitting in unsafe spaces. I actually think those are fairly related. So the truth of the matter is, I don't actually think it's a dichotomy. I think we sometimes force ourselves into false dichotomies, which then makes us have to pick a winner or a loser. I think it's a both and. So we have to work immediately, and we have to take our time. So there is a school, and this actually gets to the anecdotal question. So there's a school with whom we're working where they've asked us to work with them over 4 years because it's a school that really wants to dig deep and shift its culture, which has been incredibly exclusive. And we're like, right. And so we can come in and we're going to work with you, but we're going to have a ton of resistance, and we expect to start seeing some of the results over time. And we also said, and you have students who will have graduated before we start to see that impact. And so we have literally 4 efforts going at the same time. We're working with staff. We're working with administrators. We've created a community equity committee. But for the triage, as we're calling it, for the students who will graduate before the results are seen, we're actually in the midst of forming what's called, or what's going to be called, a student ally group. And these are students who feel like this school is not a place for them, it's not a safe space for them, and we are going to work with them to identify a student ally across difference, an adult ally, and those folks will get immediate support to address any experiences of bias that they're having in a more systemic and supportive way. And there's a whole program underneath that. But the idea of what I'm saying here is that it's a both and so we're investing in the long haul so that there's not that triage need, and we're addressing the triage at the same time. And as for and that's the piece about the short and the long term, I think it also speaks to the safe spaces piece as well. And similarly, the truth of the matter is, when an inequity comes up, we're going to have to interrupt it and in a way that is going to stop someone from being harmed. But if we're looking for somebody to be part of that process, if the person who's perpetuating, like when I was a math teacher, my bias played out in how my grades occurred, and I needed that to be interrupted. But if I was interrupted in a way that I put a wall up, that change would never happen. And so we might interrupt it when we see it in the moment, but the transformation that needed to take place might not ever get underway. So we both need to find ways of interrupting the harm and stopping the harm from happening, but also ways of engaging the person who might be unconsciously or having that implicit bias play out, be willing to look in the mirror and change. For my students, when I was a high school principal, I used to share with my students that there was a difference between being a rebel and an activist. And I would share with them that, and by my definition, a rebel needed to say something, while an activist needed to have something be heard. And so the shift and that tension that you're talking about around the immediacy and the safe space, et cetera, is really like, when do we need to just like stop something? But in this idea of being an activist, we're not going to have much traction if the way that we're acting can't be heard. Looking at some of the other questions. There's also, there was a question about resources and all. We will share a link. There was an article that I was able to have published last year from my gosh, this is terrible. I feel so ungrateful. I will get the publication. We'll share that. We'll share that publication. That goes into the framework in greater detail. Learning Forward. And the dissertation is, I believe it's available, but as with all dissertations, they're written in ways to meet the needs of the university, and much of the work that's actually been done comes on top of the dissertation. And I've had the great fortune of having a program that says study what you do, and so much of the learning for this framework has happened because that dissertation led us to do work, which is what you're hearing more about now. But we can also make that available, or make that link available. I also want to go just one more piece about the safe spaces. I actually just want to surface that I really appreciate naming the idea that when we're talking about safe spaces, having safe spaces, that usually comes at the expense of people who do not feel a safe space to begin with. And I really just appreciate the reiteration of that. Can we share resources around support and evaluation? Gosh, those were years ago. I can look for those. There's something, but in general, what I can do is give you an example of how that played out. And so where I was principal, for example, we actually flipped the script, and evaluations, 80% of an evaluation was a self-assessment. But there was a whole profession, and the reason it's going to be hard to share, I think, the resources is this was a whole professional development plan. This is work that was taken up in people's professional learning communities as well as in the regular professional development, et cetera. But what would happen is the school would do database inquiry, identify problem of practice focus area. From that, individuals would do reflections around where their areas of need are, and under that umbrella of the problem of practice, identify their own set of goals and an essential question, guiding essential question for all of their learning, all of their observations, et cetera, throughout the year. And those observations weren't just done by a supervisor, they were actually done by peers. There was peer observation, so that was a piece of it. And then there was student feedback. So I guess it was before 360s were possible in schools. It was sort of like a 360 review that played out for the whole year. That self-assessment was given to their direct supervisor, who then responded with a formal evaluation. And then that formal evaluation and the self-assessment led to a meeting with me as the school principal, because I actually was not the direct supervisor of most of the people, but really we were leveraging leadership. And then that self-assessment and that evaluation led to a meeting with the principal where we sat and established goals for the following year, and then began that cycle all over again. I realize that doing this work is powerful and necessary. However, as a Black female education leader, my work has been and can be deemed coming from a personal stance instead of ending inequities in our joint practice. How can I approach this work with white educators without them hearing racist instead of racial inequalities? Oh, I really appreciate the honesty and the tenor of that question so much. And I think that's I think there's a conversation and multiple conversations we should and could have, and I don't think this space is going to give justice to that question, but I'll put a few thoughts out there. And one of them is, in this, when we're talking about race, like, we have to flip the script, and the entry point and the brunt of the work has to be on white people. And when we think about even brain science and brain research, it shows that when we get to a place of dissonance, if somebody has been in danger too much, has been in flight, fight, or freeze, they sometimes need to be in comfort for their brain to recalibrate the chemicals to be in a more vibrant learning space. And when we create places where equity and allyship is necessary, and again, this is such a shortcut and it's not going to do justice to the answer, but we sometimes actually need our colleagues of color to not be the people we turn to have to figure out how to work with us. That we have to flip the brunt of the work onto those of us who have been sitting as bystanders or have been sitting in a more paced growth and not in that danger space that we talk about. And again, I wish this was more dialogue, and because I don't think I'm doing justice to it, but that's my immediate reaction as I am getting that we have 3 minutes left, and so that's part of that tension as well. But if that's not, if you want to talk more about that, I hope it's Jordana or Ms. Campbell. I would gladly even touch base offline if this brought up any stuff that you'd want to touch base about. Let's see. This idea of, is it a trap to call racism a microaggression? Well, I think anything can be felt as a trap. I think whether or not it is a trap is simply based on our intent. And if we're getting to a place where we need to name some stuff, if we need to just speak our truth and talk things, we should be working to create conditions where anything could be said and almost any mistake could be made in the spirit of trying to do the right thing, so that we can just work through that. Now, if it's meant to be a trap, then it's a trap. And even if it's not meant to be a trap, it might be felt as a trap, but then that's just saying the work that individuals need to do so we can engage in that very difficult discourse. I have some examples of, the dilemma with the school districts have succeeded in this transformation. I think there are districts we've worked with that have engaged in this work and are continuously engaged in this work. But the idea of entire districts doing this work is really challenging. I have more examples of schools that have engaged in this with integrity. And we've seen those results, and we've seen schools shift their culture. It's really important to know that what we're talking about is creating conditions for the changes that we already know exist to actually have an impact. And what I mean by that is we know how to teach math better, and yet there's so many places where students aren't doing well in math. And that's because many things are getting in the way, including our implicit biases. And so we're trying to create conditions so that the technology that we have, the knowledge we have, the curriculum we have, can actually have the impact it's supposed to have, or can be looked at and interrogated so that it's improved. So there's a question here from somebody who we've done work with in Chicago, and they're saying they did some amazing work where they said, before we bring this work out to our schools, it's another support provider, we're going to do the internal work, and that's really powerful. And they're continuing to do it. And so the question is, what's the sense of when it's okay to start moving outward? That's a great question, and I don't think there's a formula to it. But I do think when it starts to become, I think about the gradual release model. When it starts to become a situation where I've engaged in this process enough that I understand it, even if I'm still a learner, it's time to start looking. And time is up. So let me just end by saying thank you all so very much for being at this webinar and for being willing to try on some more interactive, different ways of being in a webinar. I hope it was productive.
Yeah, we want to thank you as well, Dr. Peters, for engaging in this conversation today and sharing with us. If you want to go ahead and reach Dr. Peters, his email address is here on the screen. So again, thank you very much, Dr. Peters.
Thank you.
Appreciate it. We will also be putting up a feedback survey that you can provide any feedback